Mr. Wang Jianxing, thank you very much for your time. So, debt diplomacy. This is a term that was coined some time ago by Indian academic Brahman Chelney. And the idea is that a richer nation deliberately engages into various projects with a poorer nation, knowing that the poorer nation will not be able to pay, to make the repayments as they are negotiated, and in the end, the richer nation either takes over assets or some other way becomes more an owner of the poorer nation's part of sovereignty, not entirely sovereignty, but certainly assets, but also influences the way the poorer nation works. Now, this is an unequal relationship that is as old as time between, bigger and smaller nations, richer and poorer nations. And you will know that this has been now leveled at China. Is it fair?
Thank you very much, Winston, for having me. And as you mentioned just now about the so-called China debt trap, I think that is definitely not true. Because, just in Africa, so each year they need hundreds of billions of US dollars for the construction of their infrastructure and also for their economic transformation and diversity. And China, apart just from the Western financing to Africa, so it's a new blood just into this market, which is in very severe shortage of a fund. I think just China financing, which is also very preferential, so is a very timely support to Africa's development. And also, I want to tell you is China now is not the biggest creditor of Africa. In November 2021, World Bank released its debt statistics. Those statistics indicate approximately 29% of Africa's debt is owed to multilateral institutions, and 42% was owed to the commercial creditors. And you know that the main players of the multilateral institutions and also the commercial creditors are from Western countries. If you put them together, 29% and 42% is almost three quarters. So you can see that most of Africa's debt is owed to the Western countries and the Western players.
So your response really is that if there is any kind of debt problem, it is one for the West and the poorer nations to solve rather than China.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And also, recently, Johns Hopkins University released a report indicating China takes only 17% of Africa's total foreign debt. And also, the Debt Justice, a UK-based charity, the Debt Justice also released a report, in one of its newest report, that the African just owed 3 more times debt to Western banks and asset managers and oil traders than to China. So please pay attention, 3 times.
One of the accusations, not necessarily the amount, but whatever amount there is, how that amount is lent and how that amount is borrowed. In other words, the terms of the lending and the terms of the borrowing. There are suggestions, there are accusations actually, we might say, that the terms are opaque and they allow China to gain an unfair advantage over the borrower. An example that is almost always touted is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which has now been leased to China for 99 years or 100 years or so because Sri Lanka was unable to make the repayments. The suggestion, the idea was that this was almost designed. This was something that China was looking to do, and it is something that China is fairly happy about because it now controls this great port.
Well, it's definitely not. And I think just in recent years, you heard about some pieces of news that China taking over Juba Airport. China is seizing, say, Antobe Airport, and Kenya government so has to mortgage. So it's Mombasa Port just to the Chinese, just for the construction of the standard gauge railway. But all say China has launched the financial cooperation with Africa for so many years, but not a single African countries so have been forced by the Chinese to mortgage their strategic natural resources like ports, mines, and etc. Just to get China's financing. And not a single African country slid into debt predicaments in cooperation with China in terms of financing. So I think just the people, just now you mentioned about Sri Lanka, I think that's also a kind of a cooperation. It's not the story that Sri Lanka couldn't just repay the money and then release the poor just to China's kind of mortgage. So because China has been running a lot of ports, we are very experienced. So sometimes that we negotiate just with some countries, some Chinese companies just can join, and the management can help those countries just to run the port effectively and also making money. So I think that's a fact, is a result of a negotiation on equal footing.
We mentioned ports, and there is this idea of the string of pearls, and that is the ports around the Indian Ocean. And there is again a suggestion that China is deliberately making these deals which would allow it to control most of the ports around the Indian Ocean. You mentioned Mombasa, there is a port in Djibouti, and others. Isn't one of the problems that the lack of transparency in when these deals are agreed, which then, when these accusations are made, it is difficult for there not to be suspicion. Is that what are they hiding? In other words, the accusations are plausible, and the lack of transparency disadvantages China's position to say what you're saying isn't right.
I think you're asking a question about the transparency between the financial cooperation between China and Africa. And China is always acting on the principle of the equality, openness, and transparency. And as you know, when we are negotiating just with the African countries, that the discussion is processed on equal footing, and the contracts conforms to the laws and regulations of the African countries, and the loan agreement will be examined and reviewed by the parliament of the African country, and all the terms and conditions of the loan agreement will be fully disclosed just to the parliament, so for the legislative body. And I think just it seems now in recent decade, people are talking about just the China debt trap, and it seems that some people, they are concerned about Africa's debt problem, but this is just the cover. Yeah, I think a lot of people, they are remaining hostile about China, and they don't believe that China will be taking a road of a peaceful rise, and they're still taking their colonial concept and the perception, and to view China's growth and China's becoming one of the great powers just in the world. So they're taking all means just to smear the image of China and to question just China's road.
We'll look at that at the moment. But do you think that I talked about I asked about the question of transparency. Wouldn't it be easier for China to just say, well, look, what you say isn't right. Look at the nature of the agreements we make, and then all of this will simply go away?
Now, this, as I mentioned just now, that all the contracts and also the loan agreements just were fully discussed just between the two parties on equal footing, and also all the details will be examined and reviewed by their parliament. So I think that that is transparent and also open. And for the I think for the commercial contract and also the loan agreement, because they're between the Chinese companies and also between the loan agreement between the two governments, and I don't think just in any countries can just spread their contract and the loan agreement just to the 7.5 billion people in the world. So it is not necessary.
It's a dilemma, because on the one hand, yes, there are commercial confidentiality and everybody does this. China found it the way it was and is operating within international rules as they are. But also at the same time, because there are these confidentiality rules, yes, it's easy for people to think, well, there's got to be something, and there's got to be something to this idea of a debt trap.
Well, I think they're over-concerned just about the contract and the loan agreement, fairness. And I think just a lot of people, they underestimated the wisdom and willpower of the African countries. So I think just the African countries have been developing their own economic road and path for so many years, and they have their experts and specialists, and they have their economists. So there's nothing to hide just in the agreement. So if China just hide some damaging or sabotaging elements or factors just into the contracts and the loan agreements, it will be easily just discovered just by the African countries. And we take African countries as our partners, with our friends and brothers and sisters. So we're not setting traps just to them. And because I think a lot of Western politicians and governments, think tanks, and also NGOs, so they are trying to sabotage or undermine just China's image. So I think they're just making some excuses just to accuse China and then just isolate, detach China and Africa, because African continent is the largest continent full of developing countries, and China is the largest developing country in the world, and we have a lot of similarities, and also we share a very similar history, being exploited and colonized by the Western powers. So I think some people, they're afraid that China's peaceful rising will expand its influence, and then the Western countries cannot just dominate and cannot just control Africa as before, and so they will not. Some Western companies, they cannot make easy money, and the Western countries, they cannot just easily manipulate those African countries.
So in your view, this is just geopolitical competition?
It is.
And well, let me put it this way, if I may. I mean, China has a policy of non-interference in the internal politics of most countries, a laudable stance to take. But that can also have certain disadvantages. For instance, some countries, and some have done, can begin projects that politically useful for them, It's been suggested that the port in Sri Lanka was more a political project than an infrastructure and commercial project for Sri Lanka. It may not have been, but the idea is that some countries do that. Now, if China as a lender comes in and lends for a project that is clearly a bit of a white elephant, isn't it time for China to take a more, in a way, closer look at this project and just say to the countries, well, look, we'd love to be able to help, but we don't think this is going to work, and walk away from it?
As I mentioned just now, then whatever projects proposed just by the African country will be discussed just by the two parties on equal footing. Sometimes we'll jointly discuss about the feasibility of the project. And also the Chinese government and the Chinese banks also place great emphasis on the repayment capacity, because the main reason is we would like just those projects to be operating well and making profits, and also will not accumulate the African countries' debt. And also, China has been cooperating with African countries in commercial field for so many years, and the China's financing mainly focus on infrastructure and manufacturing sectors. And the Chinese companies have already helped African countries to build or upgrade 10,000 kilometers of railway, 100,000 kilometers of highway, 1,000 bridges, 100 ports, and also large-scale power plants, and also roads and schools and hospitals. Yeah, and all those projects, so they will generate, motivation and also the incentive just for the African countries to develop, just to create revenue and to create jobs and bring tangible profits to the African people.
Now, the other thing that the other main accusation that is leveled at China is that China takes manufacturing into Africa and takes back raw materials from Africa. There is never any transfer of technology. Now, I appreciate that this is not a question for you, it's more a question for the African nations. But let's put it to you and just say, what if an African nation says, well, look, it is wonderful to have all these infrastructure projects, but we would like our people to be empowered to be able to do this project themselves. In other words, know-how and technology transfer. How would China feel about that?
I think you're right. In China, we're importing a lot of raw materials from Africa. And we're also importing a lot of raw materials from Australia. Yeah. And I think I think basically we are buying from Africa. We're not taking back at a very low rate like what the colonists did centuries ago. And we are really buying and at the international market price. So that will generate revenue for the African countries to improve their infrastructure and to improve their industrial production. And also, I think China is not only importing raw materials, we are also encouraging Chinese companies just to invest in Africa, just to build some industries, just from light industry to heavy industry. We are also helping some African countries to build refinery and also the refinery of oil and also refinery of minerals, and to increase their value of their exports. So in no means that China is exploiting Africa. I think as I said, as the former colonists did. So we're just we're just doing the win-win, just cooperation, just for the two continents.
So what would you say to somebody who said, well, look, China has got a great deal of technical know-how, and technological know-how. Africa needs a great deal of that, training and so on. So if there's anything that would be most valuable from China, it is that. And so why not strengthen that relationship by focusing more on that? How would China feel if African countries began to do these things themselves more, rather than asking Chinese technicians, Chinese engineers, and so on to come and do this project?
So over the past decades, just China has been helping African countries to build a lot of infrastructure and also a lot of manufacturing, sector, factories, plants. And we are in the process of building. So we are also training the local people. We are hiring a lot of people just to do all the construction. And also we are also training their technicians and their engineers, their architects. And also I think I'm saying this is a wrong conclusion that China is not sharing just the know-how and expertise with African countries. I think a lot of people have paid no attention just to the people exchange and also just training program between China and African countries. So the human resources development, between China and Africa has been developing very fast over the past almost 1 or 2 decades. So each year we invite the tens of thousands of African technicians and government officials just to China to visit different institutions and to exchange just with Chinese counterparts and also learn just the very necessary know-how and expertise just from their Chinese professors and Chinese engineers. So you can see just even right now there are a lot of students studying in China. So we are not just hiding or just put our hand just on the expertise that no one can learn from. So we are sharing. We are really sharing, because in the development of Africa, so we have realized that we need to localize that a lot of economic activities. For instance, Huawei technology company, they're in Africa for so many years, but they are going to have less Chinese. So they're giving job opportunities more and more just to the locals. Yeah, they train them and then they promote them and then just give them more responsibility and power to make decisions for the company, for the region, and for the whole continent.
All right, so you're suggesting that this idea of debt trap diplomacy is in many ways a ruse to try and drive a wedge between Africa and China. It is aimed at China's relationship with Africa. So let's look at that relationship. It is true that it goes back a very, very long way. And perhaps the most symbolic infrastructure project is the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, where over 100 Chinese technicians and their staff died building it. And it now stands very much as a monument to that relationship. The railway was used very much by liberation movements in Southern Africa and so on. So that relationship does go a long way. China has changed a great deal since those days, since the 50s and 60s. And it is, as you mentioned earlier now, quite a world economic power or a world power generally. So something has changed. Can you define for us how China feels that Africa can relate to that change, and what China would like from Africa as a long-time friend to relate to that change, especially within the perspective of this competition between China and the West?
I think you're quite right. Great changes have taken place in China. So when the Tanzania and Zambia railway was being built, it was the time just China remained very poor. But under that circumstance, China still input a lot of financing and also materials and also just the workforce to help African countries to build that strategic and a very significant railway project. I think I think just since the beginning of the 1980s, China began to open up and do the reform policy, and China became say more and more developed, and right now China has become one of the great powers just in the world. But there is one thing which has not been changed at all. That's the relationship between China and Africa. As I mentioned at the very beginning, that China is the largest developing country in the world, and Africa is also a continent full of developing countries. And we share a lot of similarities, including the history and also the prospective, task to develop our economies and to improve the livelihood of both the Chinese and African people. So that's why that China would like to join just African countries to develop just the whole economy, and also just to enhance the people-to-people exchange and to reinforce the traditional friendship just between China and Africa.
Does China feel that they're getting the response that they would wish, that they would desire from Africa, to feel that this friendship is as they intended it to be?
Yes, as soon as the COVID-19 epic began to erupt, China was fighting very hard against the virus, and also the Chinese scientific teams were working around the clock just to produce vaccines, and not only just for the Chinese people, but also for the people in other continents. I think especially Africa, because Africa right now is lack of the vaccine development skills and expertise. And then the vaccination rollout was going on very slowly just during the early period of this pandemic. So I think in China, especially just the new generation of Chinese leadership, we promoted just the community of shared future. I think especially in terms of health, and we are not only safeguarding the health of the Chinese people, but also those people in very urgent need of those vaccines. I think especially some African people, people are getting affected and people are dying. Yeah, so that's why we acted quite differently from some Western countries. They are hoarding the vaccines, just leave for their people to have the third and the fourth boosters. So we don't. Some people accuse China of vaccine diplomacy. I think for a long period of time, I watch BBC and the CNN very often, and they're only bad news about China, right? I think they have intentionally or unconsciously misread China, and they're also in China. People believe if some people, when they look at some other people, what they see is our own problems or just ill intentions. There must be something wrong with that guy. Yeah. So I think that we are helping our African friends. So we are going to, surely we want to reinforce our friendship, but we don't want to get repaid see someday just for that. Yeah. So
I understand that. I'm trying now to understand from the Chinese perspective. So you're putting forward that this is a heartfelt hand of friendship being stretched to Africa, extended to Africa. What I'm trying to understand is whether or not China is confident with the way that Africa is extending that hand of friendship back.
Yes, I think just in addition to say commercial transactions, economic cooperation. So we are looking for something between the souls of the two peoples, between China and Africa. I think just the relationship between human beings are not only money, are not only profits, and economic gains. So they're just the understanding between the two peoples, and then just respect and also the affection between the two peoples. So that will further reinforce the trust of each other and also further the economic cooperation between the two peoples. So I think just you are quite right that I think material things is just the basic, is one of the goals, but it's not the only one. I think just people to people, friendship, trust, respect, affection, and loyalty. So sometimes are more important just than the money.
Just very returning slightly to the debt trap diplomacy. China's very, very conscious of what it suffered when it was partially colonized by the Western nations. I mean, for Chinese today, it seems as if it's yesterday. They're very conscious of this, and sometimes one feels even their diplomacy is reflected through reflects the thinking that this is something that was done to us. It's very present for them. How do you think that China feels when they're accused of doing that sort of thing to African countries?
We feel quite disappointed and also very furious, and especially when some people intentionally, maybe on the basis of ill mind, to say that the neo-colonialism. No, it's not. It's not. I think just a lot of people, I think especially some people in Western countries, they have a very clear idea about what colonialism is. Yeah, and during the colonist eras, so the African continent lost 100 million people just during the slave trade. And also their economy was sabotaged. And also their natural resources were exploited and just maybe taken just with no payment. So we understand, in China between 1840 and also until the beginning of the 20th century, we remain as a semi-colonized country. We felt just humiliated, and then we were robbed, and we know the pains, severely. So that's why when some people say, well, China is launching neo-colonialism in Africa, so sometimes we are very, furious. But we know what they are doing. So they are trying, they are just doing something under sabotage, under camouflage. So they are trying to weaken China in Africa. So they're trying to break the bonds between China and Africa. And then they can continue to manipulate the African countries and to continue their mental colonization in Africa. But I think they will never prevail. I strongly believe that the evil will never prevail, and they will fail just for sure, because As I mentioned in the middle of our interview, that some people, including some governments, some countries, some politicians, some think tanks, some parties, and they underestimated the Africans' wisdom and willpower. And I think that the African countries know just what they need and what kind of tasks are were before them, and they need to find good partners and to protect their sovereignty and their own independence and develop their economy for the benefits of their own people.
So let's come to a close looking at the world as it is now. As we mentioned a number of times, China is now playing a bigger and bigger role in the world. And, we have something like in the infrastructure. We didn't mention the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, this is a major thing that, multi-trillion dollars that are going to affect the development, not just of the less advanced nations, but the world economies generally. But you've also got this is the China versus the West competition that you mentioned. It is diplomatic, it is political, and it is economic. And we have this close relationship that China established and Africa established, and both sides seem to want it to be to get closer and closer. So from the Chinese perspective, given the conditions in the world, given the situation the way it is in the world, what kind of support do you feel that Africa can give? And what would China most like, and what would you expect from their friends on the African continent?
Oh, right. I think just now you mentioned about competition. I think just surely there is competition between China and the Western countries. Yeah, but I think that there are also opportunities, right? And for instance, in one class, so we have a lot of students, and there is competition among all of them, but they should not be enemies. So they can study together, they can help each other, yeah, and to learn quickly and to be better students. So I think that I'm hoping that will be the result and circumstance between China and Western countries. So it's not a zero-sum game, yeah. And we have so many opportunities, and just to become rich together and to become better friends, and to help, some least developed countries just to pursue prosperity. So I think that's the thing we should do together. Yeah, and also I think just to answer your question, and so what China is expecting African countries just to give to China, I think just I would like to describe the relationship between China and Africa is friendship between friends, family members, and so if you're thinking in that way, so sometimes I need Africa's trust. Yeah, and China is a peaceful, rising country. So we will never, no matter how strong and how rich China will be, and we will not be, launching hegemony. Yeah, and also just bullying the less developed countries. So I think in the process of our cooperation and also people-to-people exchange, we want just Africans friends just to the trust, and also I think just the sharing, because I also here in Rwanda, I've been here for 4 years and a half. I have a lot of friends. I learned so many things from them. Yeah, and not only the culture, but also their special way of thinking and their wisdom and also their ambition. I think just we should build just the trust and also build just the determination to walk hand in hand, shoulder by shoulder, and to pursue prosperity in the future.
Mr. Wang Jianxing, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vincent. Thank you for having me.